Okay, so thanks a lot, Jan, for this invitation, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to talk about something which is very close to my heart, and that is the education system, and in particular the combination of firm-based training with training at schools, which is very often referred to as the vocational training system. I think that the economic strength of Germany is to a very large part based on that particular system. But let me get you through this talk, and then perhaps we can talk about all those issues a little bit later. So let me just give you the structure here. I will provide you first with some backgrounds and some facts about firm-based training schemes. And then I will ask three questions. First of all, why may firms be willing to train workers and to pay for it? Secondly, why may workers be willing to pay for part of their training? And thirdly, why do workers actually enroll into apprenticeship training schemes? Why don't they join the labor market straight away after secondary school and learn in firms in a learning by doing way? Now, then I want to talk a little bit about the potential welfare effects of apprenticeship training. And I will ask the question, are actually spillovers from apprenticeship training? Is it the case that when I have a firm with a lot of vocationally trained workers, that this spills over on untrained workers? And if that is the case, then there is a strong case to be made to actually fund apprenticeship training, because the market will not produce the optimal level of training. And I will come back to that a little bit later. So let's just kind of start off by thinking about vocational training schemes. There are large differences between post-secondary education systems across industrialized countries, whether it is the university system, but in particular whether it is referring to the possibility young people have after leaving secondary school. And I could extend on that. And in my view, that is the most interesting thing in education economics. Not so much to understand one system, but to understand the differences between systems and what we can learn from other systems. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, post-secondary education is usually state-provided. You go to college, you go to university, and you go maybe to some vocational schools. And I will come back to that a little bit later. We call many of these systems kind of one-dimensional. Yeah. So in the UK, if you don't do well on your A levels, that's kind of the end of it. Yeah. So you will then be on a particular track, and you can't really re-track, because you can't get access to colleges or universities. And the US is not so different from that. And many other countries are like that. Now in Europe, in continental Europe, and in particular I want to talk here about Germany, but Switzerland, Austria, and some of the new Eastern European countries have very similar systems. While post-secondary training of a very large share of every cohort is actually provided within firms by combining firm-based training with school-based complementary teaching, and we usually call that apprenticeships. So let's kind of define that a little bit closer. Apprenticeship is usually a system for training of young workers in a particular occupation. So apprenticeship is occupation specific through on-the-job training. So you go to the firm and you learn within the firm particular skills. There are huge and important differences about how that training is provided, which actually are responsible for whether a system works or not, and I will come back to that later. The dual education system is a system which combines this on-the-job training with training, theoretical knowledge, which is taught in specialized schools. So for instance, if you want to train as a carpenter, you learn accounting, you learn mathematics, but you also learn everything about the quality and the types of different woods, how you can work with them, etc., etc. And engineer for cars, other specialized knowledge is provided on a theoretical level. So that combination of on the firm, on the job training and theoretical training is called a dual education system, and it is dominant in countries such as Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. So the German apprenticeship system, and that's the system I want to talk about mostly, because the features of that system are important to understand why and whether these systems work, and at the end I will compare it to the UK system, is combining school-based academic education with firm-based training. So the training duration is between 2 and 3.5 years, and training is possible in about 370 occupations. The system is very flexible. So for instance, a normal carpenter has now been split into different types of carpenters, because technology has changed the production processes. So you now can do an apprenticeship as an industrial carpenter, for instance, which is a carpenter which is not just working with wood, but he also knows all these computer-driven machines, etc., etc. And I can give you many examples for other occupations. So that always changes. Now, interesting here is not many firms actually train. Not many firms train. So if you look at Germany, it's about, okay, so when you do this kind of stuff, you're a slave of your slides, because you have to do exactly how you have programmed the slides. So let me just say something about this red line here. The green line is the share of every cohort which undergoes apprenticeship training. And as you can see, that was more than 60% in 1955, has now reduced to something like 50%, 55% in 1985. This is the birth cohort. This is not a year, so this is the birth cohort. And is on average about 60%. So that means 2 of 3 individuals in Germany have post-secondary training, education, which is covered by the apprenticeship training scheme. The share of graduates to universities is very small compared to the Anglo-Saxon system. The reason is that the apprenticeship training scheme is providing training for many occupations where, if you were born in the UK, you would have to go to college. Nurse, for instance, or bank clerk, etc., etc. And the share of firms, and that's what I wanted to say a little bit earlier, which actually trains, is very small. About 19% of firms in 2019. Of course, these are mainly larger firms, so they cover more than 19% of workers. They cover about half of the workforce. But not every firm is training. Only a small part of firms are actually providing training for about 2/3 of every cohort. So where is the system coming from? Well, the origins of the system date back to the craft system. They date back to the craft system in the German-speaking countries as part of the Holy Roman Empire, and you find the first sources of that around 1000 after Christ. They have been then molded by guilds. Guilds have stipulated the rules differentiating apprentices, journeymen, and apprentices who had completed their training, which are basically and masters. So you start as an apprentice. After your apprenticeship training, you become a journeyman. So that means you're walking around to various firms and accumulate additional training, but make also your labor available. And then you can progress to become a master. A master is then allowed to train again apprentices. Master craftsmen can use that also as an inexpensive form of labor in exchange for providing food, lodging, and formal training in the craft. So the saying, Lehrjahre are keine Herrenjahre, as we say in German, is coming actually from those times and from this particular training. That was a hard training, but then it gave you an option which was very advantageous. Of course, a lot of protectionism went with this training. So if you were not a master, you could not do certain occupations. So the system forced individuals to actually undergo training in it. Now, let's come to what I want to talk about. And let's look at Germany. So Germany has kind of molded this system into a very regulated training scheme. In 1969, a unified vocational training system and codified the shared responsibility of the state, the unions, associations, and chambers of trade and industry. It was tightly regulated. So precise skills and theory taught are strictly regulated. The employer is responsible for the entire education program, coordinated by the German Chamber of Commerce. There is defined content and skill sets of apprentice professions which must be fully provided and taught by the employer, and everyone who has completed an apprenticeship, and that's very important, and I'm coming back to that a little bit later, has learned the same skills, has attended the same courses. Most job titles are legally standardized and restricted. So that means if I look at the certificate of having done an apprenticeship scheme for somebody who is born in Bavaria and has an apprenticeship done there as a carpenter, say, and somebody in the north of Germany, these are actually comparable. Yeah, they have gone through very regulated, very similar training schemes. And that's very important for the system to work, and I'll come back to that later. If you have any questions, please. Yes. Oh, yes, and actually they maintained it. There was no difference. There are lots of studies which actually use that similarity for various economic questions. It's a good question, yeah. Also in the Czech Republic and some of the Eastern European countries, and actually also in Denmark, and in the beginning also in the UK, because it comes from the guilds, yeah, which were in the Eastern, in the Baltic Sea, in various countries, and spread that system throughout. But different countries have molded it in different ways. Now, there is a huge international interest. Let me start with President Trump, who said many things. And one of the things I actually agree on, is that he said Germany has been a model for highly successful apprenticeship programs. As a result, Germany's youth unemployment rate is much lower than that of many other countries. So somebody told him that, and he thought that's a good thing to say. Okay, and it's actually true. So the transition from the training phase into the labor market is much smoother with the apprenticeship training scheme. So youth unemployment in Germany has been always much lower than that in many neighboring countries. Obama administration pledged nearly $200 million to support apprenticeship schemes in 2015 with a focus on the fast-growing and advanced manufacturing and health sector. Tony Blair was very big on apprenticeship training. So he launched several ambitious initiatives to increase apprenticeship training, and the Tory governments we have seen after the Great Recession actually followed that course. A lot of money has been pumped into vocational training in the UK. Theresa May has recently renewed her commitment to create 3 million apprenticeships by 2020. That must be a wrong number, because she wasn't prime minister in 2020. She was a very short prime minister, but not in 2020. So it must be a little bit later. But there is a lot of interest in the UK, in the US, in many other countries, in the German system, and not with very much success. So despite this continued interest and many past and ongoing initiatives, all these programs had only limited success. And I will try to tell you why we think that is the case. So why is the apprenticeship system less successful in England and in other industrialized countries than in Germany? And what exactly is it that makes the German apprenticeship scheme work? Okay. So the first question to be answered here is, do firms pay for training? And if so, why do they pay for training? And there has been a literature which started maybe 20 years ago by a number of important papers. Acemoglu and Pischke started that, who actually made the point that firms pay for training under particular circumstances and that is the reason for apprenticeship training. I think that literature kind of moved the entire debate in a direction which was partially true, but didn't see the whole picture. That's why I will ask the second question. What makes the system work? And why are individuals, apprentices, willing to undergo training for 3 years for wages which are much lower than what they could get in the market if they would work as untrained workers? Why does that work? And thirdly, what's actually in for apprentices? What is it you learn in firms? And fourthly, are there additional welfare effects? Are there knowledge spillovers from apprenticeship schemes? So let me start, okay? Now, let me become a little bit more theoretical here. If you think about human capital theory, which has been a very important branch in economics and labor economics. So human capital theory is actually about education, the type of education workers actually acquire. And if you think about different types of skills, so one type of skill is a skill which you can use everywhere in the labor market. You learn something and it's transportable. You learn something in one firm and you can take it with you into another firm, and it makes you productive everywhere in the labor market. Another type of skill is very specific. For instance, a skill which is only good for a particular firm, and there is no outside option. So in another firm, that skill is not needed, in any other firm. So we call the latter specific skills and the former general skills. Now, general skills mean if a firm trains you in general skills, then these skills will make the worker more productive, and they will allow the worker to use these skills also in other firms. So the firm cannot extract anything from the worker for having provided the worker with that skill. Because the worker will say, okay, if you give me now a lower wage because you trained me, I just go to the next firm because they pay me for my full set of skills because my skills are general. So that means in a Beckerian competitive model, and Becker got the Nobel Prize for this and many other very important ideas many, many years back, in a Beckerian world, firms would not willing to train workers in general skills. Now, however, that's the case in labor markets which are completely competitive. It may well be that there are some frictions in labor markets which make them non-competitive. And a non-competitive labor market, for instance, would be a labor market where a firm can extract a rent from a worker. We call that a monopsonistic labor market. A labor market where the firm, for some reasons, can pay the worker a wage which is lower than the worker's productivity. Okay? Now, this has been very important. For instance, 3 years ago, David Card received the Nobel Prize for his work on minimum wages. And that work was claiming that minimum wages may not lead to employment effects, and the argument behind that was that labor markets are monopsonistic, that actually firms can extract a rent from workers. Now let's suppose we are in such a labor market. The labor market is monopsonistic. The firm can extract a rent from the worker. Then we get into this very simple scheme here. On the vertical axis, we have productivity and wages. On the horizontal axis, we have training. Now suppose the productivity of a worker increases with training. The more I know, the more productive I am. And suppose as well that there is a wage gap between productivity and wage. So the wage is lower than productivity. And that could be for many reasons. So I don't have time to go into much detail, perhaps at the end when we have some time. Now, in this case, the higher the training of the worker, the higher the worker's productivity. So that means the more the worker is contributing to firms' output, and the higher the wage. But the gap between productivity and wage is constant. It's not changing. Now consider a situation where the gap between a worker's productivity and a worker's wage increases with training. So a situation where the more you train a worker, the more productive the worker becomes, but the profit I make on the worker is even increasing by more. Yeah? So we call that a compressed wage structure. If that is the case, and I've done this here for you in this very simple diagram, that means the profit on workers, the rent on workers, is increasing with training. So that means the better a worker is trained, even in general skills, which are transportable, the higher is the rent you can extract from that worker. And that gives an argument why firms may find it profitable to train workers also in general skills. Yeah? And a big literature and many years of work have gone into trying to understand what could create such compressed wage structures and whether there is evidence for that. Okay, let's go to the second question. So is that sufficient to explain training? Well, we have looked at data and we find that about 1/3 of the cost of training in apprenticeship schemes is paid for by firms, but 2/3 are paid by workers. So now we come to the second question. Well, there may be an incentive for firms to train workers in general skills. However, that's not sufficient to explain why firms are training in a country like Germany. So workers are paying as well. And the question is, why should workers pay for training by accepting lower wages? Now, let's just look at this very simple economy. And this economy is an economy where we have an apprentice and we have an employer. And the apprentice goes to the employer and says, train me. The employer says, sure, but you have to pay for it. I'm training you in general skills, so I'm not doing that for nothing because you are the sole proprietor of that training and you can just take it somewhere else. Well, the apprentice says, okay, but how do I know you will train me well? The employer says, oh, I show you all you need to know and I will make sure that I write you an excellent certificate at the end of the training period. The apprentice says, well, but how do I know that you will deliver on your training promise? The employer says, well, you have to take my word for it. So this is an economy without commitment. The employer can promise something, but cannot commit to it. That creates a time inconsistency problem. In the second period, when the apprentice has signed the contract, the employer will change his mind. No way I will invest much into that person. Yeah, I consider that person as cheap labor. The problem in this economy is that the market knows that. The market knows there is no commitment and the employer will not train the worker as promised. Of course, the employee knows that, the apprentice. So the apprentice will only agree to signing a training contract if the employer pays him or her a wage which is very similar to what he or she could get in the market as untrained worker. The apprentice is not willing to pay for training because there is no commitment. There's no commitment. The training certificate has no value because every other employer knows the training certificate is just made up by that particular employer. And the worker will only agree if the same wage than in other employments. Now, if you remember, there was a university which was called Trump University. It's not a joke. There was a real educational institution that went bankrupt. The reason that went bankrupt is that that university could not commit to training. And if you think that through, that's a general problem of education systems. An education system which doesn't have commitment devices will go out of the market. Here, in this particular case, we are talking about apprenticeship training. Now, let's think about another economy, apprentice and boss. Apprentice says, train me, boss says, sure, but you have to pay for it. Apprentice says, okay, but how do I know you will train me well? And boss says, I show you all you need to know. Apprentice says, but how do I know that you will deliver on your training promise? And the boss says, oh, I have a qualified master craftsman that will train you. The training content is strictly regulated by the chamber. You will attend state-run schools once a week. At the end of the training period, you will be examined on theory and practice, and the examination is harmonized nationwide, assessed by independent assessors. So that's a commitment. He doesn't get out of it because he is committed to do that by regulations. Apprentice says, okay, I will do that. There is commitment in this world, and the market knows that. So there is a value to the degree this apprentice will receive from the employer, and employer will train, and the apprentice will be willing to actually pay for their training. The training certificate has value. The worker will agree to training and pay part of it herself. That means apprenticeship wage will be lower than the market wage for unskilled workers. So you can think about that in a type of diagram for those who like diagrams, but I think you got the basic idea. So here is the training intensity. Here is what we call wage compression. In a world with no commitment, there will be no training if there is no wage compression. If wage compression increases, that means the worker, the firm extracts a higher rent, the better the worker is trained, the more training will be provided in this market. In a world with commitment, you don't need any wage compression to actually get training. Yeah? And with wage compression, those two schedules are kind of narrowing, and we have done that in a more theoretical paper using German data. If no wage compression, training intensity under no commitment is zero, whereas under commitment, it is equal to the socially optimal level, if there were no spillovers. I come back to that now. So we show in that paper that for Germany, training under commitment, under no commitment, would only be about 30% of the training we do observe in Germany. And we calculate that the share of firms in training costs is 30%, that of apprentices is about 70%. That's what I said earlier. So commitment is very important to create training. And that's why I read you this slide at the very start. So the 1969 reform of the apprenticeship training system created a framework of regulations which allows every firm who wants to train workers to commit to training if that firm is willing to underwrite that particular contract. Okay? Now, let's compare that with the UK. There is, yes? Yeah, so well, there may be, okay, we know firms are heterogeneous. So the training induces costs on the side of the firm, of course. And some of these costs are fixed costs. So you need a master, you need somebody who is trained to train apprentices, you need to have a workplace environment which is corresponding to all these needs. And these fixed costs for some firms may just not be worth their while. And that's why they don't train. And it's actually mainly small firms, very small firms, who don't train. Yeah. So let's just look at the comparison between the UK. So here we are looking at the dropout rates. 2002, 2005. In the UK, 76%, 47%. In Germany, 23%, 19%. And this is very interesting. It's the ratio of apprenticeship wages and of inexperienced, unskilled workers and apprentices. So in the UK, that ratio is 0.9. So apprentices actually get a wage which is very similar to what they could get as unskilled workers in the market. Because if there is no commitment, that's the only way to get people into apprenticeship firms. But it doesn't do anything with the training. Okay? In Germany, that ratio is 0.43. So the apprenticeship wage is far lower than the wage that worker could get as an unskilled worker. So what politics is doing, the policies we have seen, the Obama policies, the Blair policies, the Theresa May policies, the policies of the new government of Rishi Sunak is actually to support apprenticeship training by supporting apprenticeship wages. But in a world without commitment, that will bring people into apprenticeship schemes, but it will not do anything for the training. Very important. We explained that to them many times without much avail, which is a shame. Now, okay, and this is actually the comparison here. Germany has the Vocational Training Act, workplace training is regulated, etc. In the UK, there is no external statutory regulation, no nationwide training standard. There is no training and enterprise councils. Everything is voluntary at local level, purely advisory, and no statutory power. And examination is very often firm internal. So large chains like Boots, for instance, have their own examination, and they are not really comparable to other occupations with other employers. So why do workers enroll on apprenticeship training schemes? And together with Jérôme Madar, I have worked on that quite intensively. And what we do in the paper, I just want to talk about, how much more time do I have, Anja?
You have, I think, 5 more.
Oh.
10 more, you can say 10 more. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I got 10 more minutes. I have 2 more things to say. So why should workers enroll on apprenticeship schemes? What's in for them? And what we do in this study is we are looking at data, administrative data, for a very long period and build around that what we call a structural model, where workers are deciding, first of all, whether they enroll into apprenticeship training or enter the labor market directly, and then make all these additional decisions over their life cycle. And we distinguish between 2 types of learning. The one type of learning is what we call routine manual. So these are skills which are routine, but also manual. So for instance, much of the carpentry skills are manual. And another type of skill is what we call cognitive abstract. So these are skills which are required to do more abstract tasks, to be able to abstract from certain things and nevertheless come to some conclusion, theoretical skills when you run computer programs, etc. And what we find is that vocational training induces, first of all, a stronger labor market attachment. People have far less non-employment spells. It eases access to cognitive abstract sector. So accumulation of cognitive abstract skills is stronger, which has substantial benefits in the longer run. So if you look, I will show you a graph on that in a minute. If you look at the wage profiles of workers, they are very steep in the beginning. After about 5 years, not much happens anymore. However, cognitive abstract skills lead to a slight increase over the next 10 years in the labor market. Routine manual skills are basically leveling out. You learn something and that's it, and your productivity stays at that level. And apprenticeship training creates more cognitive abstract skills. There are dynamic complementarities of training that manifest at later stages of the life cycle as training compensate workers by shaping the dynamics of future job search and human capital accumulation. So individuals who go through that scheme find it easier to receive acceptable wage offers in future and find it easier to accumulate additional human capital, which is productive. Internal rates of return of apprenticeship training reveal considerable benefits for both the individual and the society at around 8 and 10% respectively. And finally, the assessment of vocational training based on immediate returns alone may therefore be inadequate, as it is subtler long-term effects on career outcomes that bring gains. And the reason why we say this is if you look at this graph here, this is a graph of the wage profile, just very, very descriptive of an apprentice. So these are the years of training, very low wages. After training, wage jumps up and then continues to increase. The green line is an unskilled worker. He starts with a much higher wage, has also very high wage growth, but then it kind of levels out. But this is just very descriptive. It doesn't tell you anything which is actually happening behind the scenes. This is all based on workers who are working at a particular point in time. Now, those workers are thinning out much more than those workers. So if you look, for instance, at the proportion that is working over the life cycle or experience cycle, then that proportion is much lower for untrained workers than it is for workers who went through apprenticeship training. If you look at the proportion of cognitive abstract tasks which workers are accumulating, that is much higher for individuals who go through apprenticeship training. And if you look at the wage growth, at the return to different types of skills, so let me just focus here on routine manual experience for trained workers, that increases, but then kind of levels out. For untrained workers, it increases, but levels out. But these skills here are cognitive abstract skills, and they lead to a wage growth which is much more persistent over the life cycle. And these are the type of skills which apprenticeship training is actually giving workers. Okay, the last 3 minutes, I want to talk about spillovers. Now, that's a very important topic. Is it the case that apprenticeship training creates additional benefits by spilling over to other workers? And we do that by looking at the entire population of German workers, isolating individuals who enter the labor market without any training, just after secondary school. And then we try to understand whether those who in the first year of the labor market experience are exposed to high quality individuals with training have a higher wage growth than those who have not. And that's a spillover. Now, there's much more to that paper, but I just want to focus on that particular aspect. Now, that means in year one, we have a new unskilled entrant into a firm. And we try to understand how trained peers and their quality affects his wage growth over the next 10 years. And we measure the outcomes, like their employment probability, their wages, etc. Let me just focus on wages here. So the effect of trained peers over time, remember, this is exposure only in the first year, is about 1% after 1 year, and it increases to something like 3% after 5 years and stays kind of constant. So every year that worker would have a wage which is 3% higher if the quality of trained peers is higher by 1 standard deviation. Okay? So that means apprenticeship training generates positive externalities. And if that is the case, then apprenticeship training, there is a strong case to actually subsidize apprenticeship training. Okay, so let me just conclude. How can we make apprenticeships work well? regulation of entry into certain professions through apprenticeship training requirement, regulate starting a business, commitment, the value of a degree is important, make it part of the multiple path system, as for instance in Germany, where individuals who have completed at least 2 years of apprenticeship training, as well as 3 further years of work experience, are allowed to enroll in universities. So with that, I would like to conclude. There's a very strong case for apprenticeship training. Initially, Anja and Jen pointed out that in Denmark, there is a problem getting people into that scheme. There is a problem in the UK, there's a problem in the US. I have tried to explain to you why we believe this system is not working in these countries. But there is also, of course, an issue of giving individuals multiple chances. So for instance, if you are 16 years old and you have to decide, do I go to university? That means I need to stay until high school, or do I do apprenticeship training? And there is no way back. There is only one chance. Then people may say, okay, I may not be very good in studying, but you know, I give it a go. What we always believe is very important for education systems is that systems give a second chance. Individuals require their abilities very often later in life. So if you are from, say, a disadvantaged household, you may not actually understand that you're actually pretty smart because, you know, the context is not really the context you need to understand that compared to a very advantaged household. So it takes more time. So we want to give young people the possibility to change track. And that's why this part here is very important for the implementation of apprenticeship schemes. So you should give young people the opportunity that after they have done their apprenticeship training, have worked a little bit in the labor market, and then discover, well, actually, I'm maybe, I could become an economics professor. Why not? That you give them the possibility to enter university or higher education. And these are some papers. This is the website of our new institute in Berlin, which Ellen and Jen mentioned. And please follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now the mic is on, right? Yeah, and we'll love to take questions. And please just do a short presentation before commenting or asking questions.
There's one here.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome.
Anders Urskov, retired. What you're saying, I love it, is that learning by doing is a good way of learning. And that shouldn't come as a surprise in a strange way. In Denmark today, actually, the basic school system it's being proposed to combine classroom teaching with much more practical training. And also, if we talk about how to do with the 20% that hardly learn anything in school, then practical training is absolutely necessary. And also to integrate some of the immigrants' kids practical. So the whole idea is wonderful, but in a way it could be expanded much more as it is perhaps already in the folkeskoledebat in Denmark. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very, very good point. Let me make one remark, because everybody talks at the moment about refugees and how we integrate them. Now, one disadvantage of a very regulated system is that it keeps people out who have not gone through the system. So one problem of Germany is to integrate refugees into the labor market, because the labor market is so certified. So if you want to become a baker, but you don't have a certificate as having done an apprenticeship scheme, it's actually pretty hard. On the other hand, a refugee who may go back to Damascus has a little incentive to enroll into an apprenticeship scheme to become a baker, because that degree is worth nothing when he is then going back and starts his bakery in Damascus. So that is a problem which there's a big political discussion people try to actually fix. The English labor market, the UK labor market, is much more flexible, which explains why many refugees want to go there. So everybody can buy a bag, 5 tools, and call himself a plumber. Yeah. Now that, of course, is on the one hand not a good thing for the overall economy, but it is more welcoming for refugees, as you just pointed out. So these things have to be balanced, of course, as well. Thanks for that comment.
And there are a few questions here.
Hi. Clément Brébion, Copenhagen Business School. I was wondering about your thoughts on subsidies. You mentioned it in your talk. You said that if there is a positive welfare effect of apprenticeship training, then potentially let's subsidize it in countries where it's underdeveloped. But then there is the risk that if you have no commitment, those subsidies will simply increase incentive to go for cheap labor, basically. And including in a country such as Germany, where commitment is strong, then small firms may not train because it's too expensive. If you subsidize it, perhaps they will start training because then apprenticeship becomes cheap labor as well. So how should we think about subsidies in both contexts, where there is commitment and if there is no commitment?
Well, I mean, that was a little bit a kind of theoretical argument. So, of course, the spillovers. So when let me answer that with an anecdote. Every flat in the UK has a gas boiler. You can buy a contract for that boiler to be maintained. So when I moved to the UK, I bought a contract. So every year on that contract, somebody comes to look after your boiler. Now, I shockingly realized these people have no idea about boilers. Actually, I knew more about that boiler because I checked it on the internet. And it happened 2 times that my boiler didn't work after that man kind of went home. And every now and then, he brings a young man to learn the trades. Now, that's when we started that last paper. Because, if there is no training in the labor market, how do you train workers? Even if you think not about the apprenticeship training scheme. Yeah? And that kind of gave us the idea there may be a critical level of training in occupations or in the labor market below which everything crumbles, but above which actually the whole thing is regenerating itself through spillovers. And that was the idea for this particular paper. And we calculate that particular level in that paper. And the externality argument is, well, if the only person who benefits from training is the trained worker, him or herself, then this should be, in a competitive world, basically be paid by the wage. But if that worker is also creating positive spillovers to other workers, then this is a positive additional externality for which is very good for the economy, but which actually asks for a level of training which should be higher than the level we see if individuals make individual decisions. So that was my comment on the positive spillover effect.
I think I saw one more hand. Who was that? No, I didn't. Perhaps, yes. And now we'll know your name in a second.
Thank you. My name is Asbjørn. I'm from the think tank Sevilla. I was wondering whether you have, in your research, also have looked into the sort of decision situation that focus on whether you take apprenticeship or go to college or some alternative educational route. Because what you've shown convincingly, I think, is that there is, a case to be made for getting into an apprentice program compared to being unskilled labor. And I think the same has been shown in Denmark several times. But I think from the individual's point of view, it's also a situation where you should choose apprenticeship over other routes. And in particular, because you said that it was a cognitive abstract skills that was really paying off in the long run, I was wondering whether you looked into that alternative.
The simple answer is no, but it's a very important point. I tell you why. So when we started that project, we have the problem in, well, first of all, the early cohorts in Germany would have a very interrupted study history. So you would study for 15, 16, 17 semesters, doing things in between, etc. But the main reason why we did not look at that particular decision is because of the top coding of wages in the social security data. So for individuals who have very high wages, we stop observing them. And that's, of course, a big problem for this type of analysis. So that kind of motivated that initial choice. But you're totally right. It would be very interesting to look also at that particular choice.
Thank you so much. Very convincing indeed, I must say. And what a relief to know that quality, when in standard, pays off, and return of investment, even for the firm, is of course key in this situation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.